What's going on, gang? Coach Joe here, Doc and Jock Podcast. I want to thank you for listening to the Doc and Jock Podcast, and thank you for the support of the show. We love getting your reviews. We love getting your feedback. Make sure, guys, if you're not following us on Instagram, Facebook, hooking it up with a review on iTunes. And, guys, we really appreciate what you're doing in all the social media challenges.
And guys, those reviews mean a lot to us, and they push the needle forward for our podcast, and they help us really be able to create more great content, more valuable content for you guys to learn and hopefully improve your life, because that's what we're doing this for. Coach Joe and I spend a good bit of time on this, and we enjoy it, and we hope you do too, but we'd love to hear from you. So if you got the time, head over to iTunes, leave us a review, and we'd love to hear from you.
We have Kelly Starrett on the show, and you missed it, but his daughter was just talking to us about lifting sumo style. She likes to go big, huh, Coach?
You know, she likes to pull. You know, we do a lot of, you know, position training, mechanics training, skill training. George is always like, "Hey, Coach." She doesn't call me Coach. She's like, "Hey, old bald guy, can I pull today?" That's really what it's about. I don't know where she gets it.
Well, very cool. Well, we're happy to have you back on. This is actually, if you count the little recording you did for our question session with you from the Twitter folks, this is your fourth appearance, and I wanted to say thank you for that, because some guys, Kelly, who have a big rep in the strength and conditioning field, we're finding out that they only do certain podcasts and they need downloads. How important it is for you to just get out there, spread your message, and kind of grassroots getting it out there, just talking to folks and being with you know, in the podcast sphere with shows like ours.
Well, you know, people don't realize this is a volume business, and that if you're going to make any margins, you have to do lots of volume. And I don't know how much you guys make on your podcast, but me, when I get to appear on podcasts, you know, the key to making zero a really big number is to multiply zero by a lot of big numbers. So, no, look, do you remember that Saturday Night Live, like the bank that made change, and their key to making change was, you know, making money off change was volume. You know, the key is, you know, who are you talking to? These are our people. We are all engaged in a gigantic experiment. And yeah, there's some times where, you know, someone's like, "Hey, I just started this podcast. I'm in my dorm room." And I'm like, "Hey, why don't you practice a few more times before you call me?" That's fine. You know, but we, you know, part of our weekly workflow is we book time to talk to people, because it's these conversations out in public that ultimately drive change and drive consensus and open people's minds to best practice. So, you know, if you set some arbitrary threshold, you just sound like an ass to me, but, you know, whatever. You know, I've been on Rogan, I've been on Ferris, and you know what? And I'm not too proud to slum it over here on the
Doc and Jock
show.
Yeah, thank you.
Dude, I just I'm almost done listening to the latest I think it was the Dan Flores Joe Rogan podcast about coyotes. Have you guys listened to that?
I have, actually.
Oh my gosh,
they're neat animals.
He wrote this American Serengeti book about, like, animals that used to live here. Like, we had a cheetah and a lion and this huge, like, short-nosed bear or something like that in the U.S., like a American Serengeti, basically. He wrote this book, and he was talking all about, like, coyotes and how if the more you try to kill them, the more they breed. So that it's like they're everywhere now, except for Hawaii, I guess. So, man, it is so interesting. I'm telling my wife about this coyote stuff, and she's not into it at all. She thinks I'm a big dork because I think coyotes are interesting, but I can't stop listening to this sucker. It's great.
Well, in our family, we would give them due respect and pronounce it coyote.
And they're everywhere, right? They're probably all over where you're at, huh, Kelly? Like,
we see them all the time. We actually just last week we were driving in Marin and saw this big ass coyote on the side of the road, and it's cool. And actually, in our neighborhood, we're up against a lot of open space up here, and you can hear the coyotes howling and crying, and it's kind of eerie. You're like, oh yeah, I'm part of the food chain. It's real.
That's true. Well, what's interesting about that is this guy said that coyotes howl at night as a roll call, and if they don't hear a lot of howling back, that means there's less of them around, and then the females actually start going into heat. So they actually start reproducing more when there's not enough of them around. So it's like their evolutionary superpower. So the more you try to kill them, the more they go into heat and breed. It's the craziest animal. It's insane.
Can you imagine if that held true for lots of other conditions, like meeting your wife, deadlifting, You know, I mean, like, you know, like you look around, there's no plates, so all of a sudden you can put more plates on your bar. I mean, I think that's an allegory for the way the world should work, honestly. The coyotes are onto something.
Well, essentially, guys, you've hammered on why I had to get a vasectomy. My wife, for whatever reason, just kept getting pregnant. So upward and onward, there's my shot to bring it up again. But
you're like a coyote yourself. That's actually very true, man. You reproduce endlessly if possible.
Well, one thing they didn't have in this American Serengeti, and this is a great segue, is supple leopards. So we want to get into what you're doing over there, Kelly, and we know that you guys are kicking ass with some new coursework. We actually had Travis Jewett's going to be on the show on the Friday release to also talk about what you guys are doing, and you guys are rolling out some cool stuff, and you're out there doing the live seminar again.
Yeah, it feels. Here's what's happened. The world has evolved. You know, Danny. Poor Danny was, you know, early beta user of the model. And what we saw is that when we were 10 years ago, I've been teaching this course since 2008.
Okay.
And when we started this thing, literally it was, speak of the Serengeti, it was abysmal. I mean, people had zero reference, you know, you just read like a Pavel book and you'd watch one internet video and we literally would show up and be like, this is your leg. And your leg works like this, and people were like, "That's holy shit! I PR'd on my deadlift," and just by knowing about my legs. And you know, it was very simple. We would just show people some of these basic positions and where they were lacking, and some ways to get in there. And it was PR City. And fast forward, literally a decade, and what we found is in sophistication, people are ready to have the next conversation. We understand a lot more. We're more efficient, and what we now have seen. And I think people fail to see how the world has evolved in 10 years because it's difficult for us as mere mortals to hold put up the first MWOD video in 2010, there was very little YouTube action. Your iPhone actually didn't have a video camera on it. And the world has just, has changed in the way we consume information and the number of coaches out there teaching. And I don't know how many, courses there are, being pitched towards people right now, but I'm guessing it's hundreds and hundreds. And what we realize now is that people are really starting to do the right thing, that people become much more sophisticated about their training, they're warming up and cooling down more effectively, their technique is getting better. And yet what we need to see is that we needed now to move into the place where we're going to establish what we call range of motion benchmarks, or movement vital signs, because I think people are still struggling with, am I normal or complete or not? And our model that we've been working on and refining for 10 years now, literally, a good model has to be explanatory, has to explain what you're seeing and why you're seeing it. The model also has to be predictive. So we should be able to say, with this range of motion limitation, we expect to see these problems. Right? Whether they're mechanical in nature or they're injury-based, we can still predict the positions that are going to challenge you based on your range of motion. But also, it's got to be, moving forward to be replicable. And what we need everyone to be able to do is eventually get to the place where we can all establish what normal range of motion is, what full physiologic range is, and then how to best express that. And what we've realized in the 102 is that the coach now has really become a much more sophisticated movement practitioner, for lack of a better word. I don't want to say provider, but say movement practitioner. But they're the person who is on the front line. They have become what Danny and I, have realized is really the combat medic in this entire sports performance and wellness continuum. And that means that when you go for a run and your knee hurts after that run, you're not injured, and you're definitely not going to see a doctor. And chances are you're not going to see a physical therapist. So who you can tell? You can tell your coach your knee hurts. And our current models don't empower the coach to, become enough curious to be able to say, hey, look, let's see if there are some flagrant violations of your basic range of motion, your basic movement lexicon. And two, how do we take a crack at improving the neighborhood by reperfusing those tissues and by feeding slack to the system so that we can get you out of this incident category, right? Because you're not injured. You just have something going on. And that's really what this course has come about. We teach, blood flow restriction techniques. We teach, it's the basics of of scraping and dry tooling, and about reperfusing, and more importantly, we're really trying to empower coaches to become curious about why they can't move. What's going on. So if someone is reversing and rounding their back when they go to the setup in the deadlift, the first thing you should do as a coach is try to cue them out of that. And then the second thing you should try to do is become curious about saying, lay down and let me see if you have any hip flexion. And we can test that actively and we can test that passively. And we're showing coaches now how to do passive movement assessments so that we can get to the bottom of the problem. Because right now, the current model is, we've got all these mobilizations that can fix you, and the coach isn't empowered enough to make the leap between watching someone move and understanding what the specific problem is underneath that movement, if it's not technique.
Well, I think the one thing that is it really simplifies things quite a bit for people in the explanation in this course is the I3 model. So we take a couple minutes and explain that kind of continuum of the I3 model and where where does a coach fit within that? And then where does the practitioner fit within that? Because I think there's these gaps that we talk about in kind of gray area, and there's overlap there. But where do they fit within that I3 continuum as well?
Sure. My trying to understand and apply the way logic and systems theory to our field, I went down this rabbit hole of complexity theory, and one of the theorists is a guy named Dr. Charles Perrow, who wrote a book called Normal Accidents. And what he does is he looks at complex technological systems and ultimately tries to show that when these systems are so complex and they have a lot of internal feedback mechanisms that are tightly coupled, right? And I'll give you an example of what that means in a second. If we don't work to simplify the system, in fact, what we do is we overlay other complexity of systems. So we start to overlay another diagnostic tool, another movement screen, another measurement device. We haven't actually streamlined the system. We've complicated the system. And what ends up happening then is that when we end up having normal expressions of the system, those turn out to be, in his case, nuclear accidents, right? And when he looks at the nuclear power plant industry. And what he says is, hey, look, this isn't a fluke accident. This is a normal expression of a system that has undergone what he calls self-organized criticality. And that self-organizing criticality can be expressed for us as, hey, I'm all of a sudden missing my hip internal rotation, right? And if I keep working out and moving in this way, the expression of potential loss of force and dysfunction that ends up with injury or a problem or sidelines me is actually not a fluke. That's a normal expression of this complex, compromised system. And what he says is that, but hey, look, you work in a power plant, and every once in a while, like a handle will snap off a gauge, and that's a problem. And that's what he calls an incident, right? And but it's not an accident. And when I read that, I was like, well, holy moly, what is that? That's incident is when someone says, hey, I deadlifted heavy, my back's a little sore today, right? Or I did some pull-ups and my shoulder hurts a little bit, or I swam and I feel achy, or but I'm not injured. That's not an injury, and it's an incident. And so the question becomes out of that logic, discussion of that mind experiment is who's responsible for that? Because the system currently is set up to address injury. The system is set up to wait until we're completely broken. And yet on the other side of the spectrum, what I realize is that, we have to be able to go from cause to effect and effect back to cause. And he uses this language that I ripped out of there, and he calls it a trivial event in a non-trivial system. And the problem is that we have a lot of these trivial events in non-trivial systems in our movement language. So if you catch a full clean, receive a full clean, and you make a reception, but you catch. You shouldn't call it the barbell catch. It should be the barbell reception. If I'm just being clear in my vernacular here.
Unless you're a Pittsburgh, I was going to say, unless you're a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, then it could be the immaculate barbell reception.
The immaculate.
Right?
That's right. So if I jump under the bar and pull myself under the bar, and I turn my feet out and slam my arches to the ground, and my knee slams in, and I stand up, and nothing happens if I stand up the weight. The question is, how do we value that? Because, if I stood up and PR'd and won the meet, great job, high five, does that translate to sport? That's one question. But the other question is, well, if that ultimately leads to a collapsed arch and a torn meniscus and an achy, worn out side of my compartment of my knee and a little patellar tendinopathy and tightness in my calf, right? That little slam where I destroyed my feet or collapsed the arch and slammed my knees in, I didn't cause a problem. The thing snapped off, the handle of the gauge. But what ended up happening is I had what we call a trivial event, and your non-trivial system, and your body is a non-trivial system. So eventually what we need to do is say, hey, look, let's agree that we're going to make mistakes. That's called learning. And the body is a robust system that is able to buffer our making mistakes. I get a little rounded sometimes when it gets really heavy. My upper back rounds when I'm front squatting. I'm doing my best. When I bench and I get fatigued, my elbow flares a little bit. Right? Those are okay mistakes. But if I'm practicing them over and over again, ultimately the expression of that dysfunction, especially when I start adding in the complexity and the feedback mechanisms of my body. Suddenly I'm sleep deprived. Suddenly I'm stressed out. Suddenly I'm a little hypohydrated. Suddenly I start to see the biopsychosocial model, the environmental loads aggregate. I'm stressed out, not sleeping, fatigued, and then I slam my knee in. And what we see, for example, is a girl like Miranda Oldroyd tearing her ACL under a full clean at the games. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. In fact, it's not an issue. We just say, hey, that's a normal expression of the system. Why? Because she jumped and landed with her feet turned out a million times and her knee slammed in. But this time it was really hot. She was pre-fatigued and she was at a maximal load. And by the way, she couldn't buffer all of those things. And so what we see is this expression of the system as a normal accident. And what we need to do, and what we're trying to do in this 102 course, is give people the roadmap to really knowing and identifying what the incomplete mechanics are. So we're really clear and said, hey, look, this is what we all agree is normal range of motion for the body, from American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons to American Academy of Family Practitioners, Norkin and White, the physical therapist. Everyone in a standard deviation of normal, right? That's not the person who has the x-rays with the 1 in a billion Scottish hip, right? This is the normal range that everyone agrees on our basic physiologic capacities and abilities of a human. And we say you should be able to assess that and understand what that looks like in movement. And then here are some tests where we can, one, challenge the passive and active nature of those movements, and two, challenge the technique with things like tempo and breathing. And so once you come through this, because we have worked really hard on identifying what the bookmarks of range of motion are, then it's really simple to say if someone is at full capacity. And so instead of using correlates for movement, we're actually using the exact movements in ways that are simple and scalable and repeatable and explanatory in nature. So, you can walk out of here and say, someone's like, hey, I want you to assess my shoulder. We're like, no problem. Are you at full capacity? Where are the tests? Where are the problems? Is this a technique and motor control issue, or is this a simple biomechanical tissue restriction? Let's at least get to that and move beyond what the physical therapists are saying, which is ish, right? That's normal-ish. It's good enough, right? Did you put the weight over your head? You're fine, right? Versus saying, I can do what my body is supposed to do, which, by the way, gives me access to full range of motion, and more importantly, what we say is full potential and full power.
No, and I want to get into that, the assessment, because I think it's important because you bring up value and you bring up interesting terms, and where I see the gaps in this situation are you have an athlete who moves all the time, he's in the gym, he's training hard, he's doing his thing in front of all his coaches, and then all of a sudden when something does happen and we have one of these accidents or these events that cause injury or whatnot, they go to this stranger, this physical therapist who isn't using the same language, hasn't seen them move all the time. So talk to us about how you are empowering that coach, and maybe walk us through what that assessment might look like. For example, the shoulder.
Well, I think you hit on a couple things there, and one of them is, it's not that we aren't working at the limits of our safety. We're all of us are teaching technique and obsessing about it, right? This is the gym is a very safe place, and what we need people to understand is that technique is actually the expression of good physiology. So, the Russians weren't telling you armpit forward, because they were trying to waste your time. They figured out that that's actually the most stable position for the shoulder when you're carrying heavy weights over your head. You definitely can flare the elbows and internally rotate and round your back. You can do that for a while at first, and then until you can't. And so you can't, and it more importantly doesn't translate. You can't do handstands in that. You can't swim in that position. So what we've worked out for a long time is that human beings are obsessed with going fast and lifting big weights, and we've always been so. And the technique now, because we can be so interdisciplinary and we all speak so many languages, largely in part due to the nature of the world and Greg Glassman and Ido Portal and these thinkers, is that we all can speak gymnastics now and some parkour, and we all speak a little powerlifting, thanks Mike Bergner, and Olympic lifting, and we can do all these things. And the key here is that what we haven't established is what full capacity is, right? It's ish, and it looked okay, but we haven't said, by the way, here's where the speed wobbles begin. And when we get injured, let's say in the gym or in real life, like actually doing sports and competition or combat, then what ends up happening is you go into this rabbit hole of sports medicine, which has nothing to do with the way human beings actually train for running or gymnastics or Olympic lifting or combat or sport or soccer or whatever. It's this correlate language of correlate tests that the athlete doesn't understand, and positions that don't seem relevant, and a whole bunch of movement assessments that aren't in the language. Like, why are we assessing weird shoulder positions in physical therapy if someone can't say, oh, this is my overhead position. Oh, now you're testing my hang position. Oh, now you're really looking at what the long lever position looks like in the front rack. Oh, I get it. So what we need to do is more closely conjoin that experience for the athlete so we can tell a cogent story, right, from rehab back. And remember, a model is only really good if it's also predictive and explanatory, right, at all cohorts. So you have to be able to talk about children and child development. You have to be able to speak to Olympians. You have to be able to speak to moms and dads just wanting to front squat and run a little bit in the gym. You have to be able to speak that language, and it has to transcend models. So if you, or has to transcend discipline. So if you're a physical therapist, you can't have some, imagine you and I are training in the gym, and then my knee is tweaked. I'm like, you need to go see a physical therapist. And then I walk in, and the physical therapist is like, from now on, the language of movement will be in Esperanto. And you're like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Instead of the language that is the way the body expresses itself, which is the positions that reflect how we move in these cardinal positions. So, when I bring my hand behind me into a bench press-like shape, that's the same shape I use when I run with my elbow. That's the bottom position of the burpee. That's where I finish position for my rowing. And if I don't have that range of motion, then I, as a coach, I should be able to predict what the compensation is going to be. And as a physical therapist, I better say, hey, what positions hurt? And you're like, oh, I don't know, it hurts all the time. I just woke up like this. Like, that's not what it is. What you're saying is, oh, it hurts when I go from a snatch to overhead. Now we have start position and finish position. And then the physical therapist, we're agnostic about how you want to treat that and reclaim that. But what we can say unequivocally is these are the end ranges of motion that we should assess. And the athlete needs to be able to see that. The coach needs to be able to see that. And so does the physical therapist. So if you come through a 102 course, we actually have an assessment paper, right? A chart, so that you can say, here are what we're working on. Here's our flow, here are our positions, here's the systems approach that we're trying to resolve this positional inefficiency or this motor control problem. And then if you can't solve it in one or two, you've taken a crack at it, then you hand that over, there's this continuum of care. And so to your point, what we start to see is that the strength coach really starts occupying a little bit of the space of the provider, only because the strength coach is a position expert. They're a movement expert, and their job is to be able to not just get people big and strong and fit, that's called fitnessing, but also to resolve their movement inefficiencies, right? Otherwise, there better be a physical therapist in every, or chiro or an osteo, in every squat session you ever do. Otherwise, shut the hell up and get on board. Otherwise, your model is obsolete. No wonder people don't trust their providers. They only go to them when they're on fire. Then the provider's like, oh yeah, don't lift anything heavy. And by the way, do this lame ass shoulder exercise that works for detrained people, but also doesn't work for Olympians.
And what I think is empowering about that makes sense is even you could even simplify it where the coach isn't necessarily even. We want them to be the position expert, but they're also an expert on that person. So to some degree, that physical therapist, that practitioner
totally
should take into account a little bit of what that coach is saying, because they've seen the person. And
I think that's really insightful of you, because who do you want to get you dressed for the prom? I mean, the person who lives with you and knows you and knows you're having a fat day, or the person who's like shows up and is like, here's the suit I just pulled off this rack. Like, that doesn't work at all.
That's right.
And to your point, your coach should have the working language to explain and describe how you move and what your tendencies are. And to a lot of point, our coaches do. They're like, yeah. Joe's a good muscle snatcher, but you ask him to do those heaving snatch balances, and he sucks, right? And right, and that actually underneath that silly example is a whole lot of information about how you move and what ends up happening when you start challenging your range of motion with change of direction or depth or competency. So that person is really the best advocate for you, and more importantly, you're the. I'm telling athletes, I'm like, look, who do you spend 3 to 5 hours a week with every day? They're like your girlfriend, and they're like, nope. And I'm like, who is it? And you're like, your coach. Oh, yeah, that's right. So that dude, that coach is the place where we need to have this intervention. And it doesn't have to be, and so that people, who are listening aren't like freaking out, like, oh no, coaches are physical therapists. No, they're not. But they are experts in beginning to resolve these positions, and the techniques that we apply, the band distraction, the voodoo flossing, the perfusion, the smashing, these are all techniques that allow us to improve our position. Well, they also happen to be the same techniques that we use to resolve the dysfunctions related to movement incompetency. And I think that's where the physios are, they get all in a tizzy, because they don't even have benchmarks for range of motion or functional positions. I'm like, what are the positions you value? Can you show me what full range of motion looks like expressed in the shoulder when you go overhead? And they're like, overhead. It's like ish. You just put your arm up, and it's over your head now. And that's not good enough. And what we need to do is make sure that everyone is clear about, if I ask you to go overhead, what that should look like. And so that we have this continuum of care between the physio speaking the movement strength conditioning language, which also, we're seeing people get very savvy on, and the coach, being able to describe and implement the same techniques that we're using to improve position on the other end.
I think you hit the nail on the head too, in terms of the assessment and how it needs to be non-specific to sport, activity, whatever somebody that's trying to do, or age, because movement is movement, and even in the last month or so, I've there's a master's class, 55 and older, at this CrossFit gym near us, and their coaches invited me in to assess all of their athletes that were between 55 and like 75, and I took them all through it, and I got a resounding kind of similar response, and it was, why didn't we do this when we first came here? And same thing with kids that I've had that are as young as 12 that are, playing competitive soccer or whatever. And they're asking the same question. Their parents are asking the same question is, why didn't their school do this? Or why didn't their coach do this? So the assessment, the importance of that assessment, can you, in your words, describe when is the ideal time for somebody to use that? And then how often should they be reassessed?
Well, here's the deal around that, and the only reason, those people necessarily didn't understand the assessment is that we weren't clear about what the goals or what the field of play was for the squat, right? And most importantly, the thing we need to do is not talk about playing soccer. It's not a classroom activity. Like, we're going to go out and actually touch the ball, and we're going to do some passing, and then we can be a little more sophisticated about that. And what people don't realize, and what coaches don't realize, is that we're running assessments every day. They're just not formal assessments. It's called squatting and push-up and press and deadlift and bench and row and jump and land, and that's the assessment. But what we haven't done is sort of consummate that entire experience with the coach. It's not just about putting someone through an air squat. It's about being able to see it every day. And I think what you're pointing out is that our assessment is show us you can easily hip hinge to the bar to a deadlift. And if you show up with a blown out back and your back's all sore and or you can't get to the bar, or you're inefficient and we have to put you on some plates, then those can be triggers to use that day's primary movement as an assessment opportunity, right? Because now I can become curious about it. Because if my athletes can move in the complex language of formal strength conditioning, chances are there's not a horrific limitation unless my athletes are giving away power and I'm seeing that as a coach. So as we press overhead, my elbow, for example, should look like it's on a rail. It's a straight line. But what ends up happening is you see people press overhead, and as they get to overhead, they flare their elbows. And suddenly we're seeing massive rotation early in range as someone presses up, instead of maintaining integrity and connection through that range. So as a coach, I can be like, I noticed that when you bench press or press overhead, your elbow flares like you're a chicken flapping or something, like, wow, and what we need to do is then become curious about that. Can I cue my way out of this? Because the first thing we need to do is not do a bunch of correlates for movement. The first thing we need to do is assess in the actual thing that we're doing. Like, if you want me to assess your bow shooting, Danny, I'm not going to.
Which is getting better, by the way.
Of course it is. There's this thing called practice, son.
Well,
and zombies.
Stray cats. And zombies, yeah.
The thing I'm not going to do is, assess how you hold the string, and then look how you put the arrow on, and then be like, no, let's go through some drills about putting the string on. You're like, don't you want to see me shoot? Show me your shooting first. And then we can have the next conversation. And I think what we've done is we've got everyone shooting now, but we're ready for the next conversation. So more importantly, we also haven't, in the language, I think we've backdoored this a little bit, is that we haven't done a good job of taking the next step. Because if you go into any strength and conditioning facility in the world that's not just doing bullshit fitness, what you're going to see is that people are deadlifting, they are performing the basics of Olympic lifts, right? They are doing things like body weight control. They are running and rowing and jumping and cutting. And what we need to do is say, great, everyone agrees that benching is important, pressing is important, deadlifting is important, squatting is important. Now let's go ahead and just round that out. And so we're not sort of unclear about what the real language is. I mean, if I just knock the punctuation and the capitalization off on your sentences, and we just be, punctuation doesn't matter. I can do that. I mean, that's, I can write lots of sentences with misspelled words and no punctuation, and you can understand what I mean, but it sure is nice to have grammar.
Sure. No, it's this language piece, I think, is essential, and I think the assessment is very important for the coaches to empower them to take the next step. But this course that you're teaching, the 102 course, isn't all just about assessment and language. We're all going to get some practical application of different techniques. And what I'm selfishly going to ask you about is an issue for me, and we talk about coaches and people banging in the weight room and going crazy, but this idea of down regulation is also pretty important because, athletes, a lot of times what we need to do is calm them down and get them ready for the next session. When you guys get into down regulating, what are we teaching in this course, and why is that so important for athletes?
It's a great question. We have gotten really good at spinning people up.
Yep.
Our movement prep, 8-hour energy shots, pre-WOD. You take beet juice and your all face is tingling. You're like, let's do this.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we're trying to do, and all need to do, as I said, in sort of applying this complexity theory model, is that we need to make sure that processes and practices are integrated. That there is a significant continuum of thought that starts and finishes. So we're not adding more systems and more, because what's great, you go to a yoga retreat, and you're like, this is awesome. I feel so zen. I love this. But when do I do this?
That's right.
I have 2 kids and a job, and I've got to train. And, when am I going to spend 2 hours doing a down regulation Zen breathing practice? Like, it doesn't happen. And so one of the things that you're addressing is the fact that athletes don't know how to turn off very well, and we want to show them how we can integrate practices and streamline their day so they can do that and mobilize and improve their positions. But also, we want to. This fits into our model of spine first or nervous system first thinking, and that we need to make sure that we are accessing the central nervous system at the same time that we're trying to improve a position or improve tissue health, so that it's not like trying to push a dead car without the key in the ignition. If you're trying to jumpstart a car and you don't have the key in the ignition, you can push on and push on and push on. It's never going to turn over. It's not until I put the key in the ignition's on, start the car, and then pop the clutch. And that also is an integrated practice, which we can then show people how to structure a day. So here's where we think you should do these practices: soft tissue mobilization, joint mobilization. Here's how we think you can spin up more effectively. And by the way, this breathing mechanic, which is part of our assessment, about being able to maintain the competence of your ventilation in these bodyweight positions, here's how you can also use that same technique to chill out at night, how you can spin down, and also how you can access your tissues in a way that doesn't fight your own nervous system. And that's all part of showing people, that they already, possess the skills. Remember Mr. Miyagi, had Danya-san do all that silly bullshit, and then he just fought him.
Yeah, that's right.
And he was like, da, 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 and he's like something he was waxing on and painting the fence, and he was all confused. And people basically have the tools, they just don't know how to optimize it, or they're not doing it correctly, or they're not timing it correctly, and they can't see the dots. Because what Danya-san thought he was doing was, a bunch of chores, which just felt like a bunch of disparate work. And what we need to do is really work to integrate these practices so that people can train, and then they can also chill, and then they can watch TV or read a book. And people are like, I mobilize an hour a day. I'm like, what is wrong with you? Are you a 40-year-old virgin? Like, how does your partner deal with that? That's not a hobby, bro. Like, smashing your quads is not a hobby.
Well, what I thought was an interesting addition, and this I did not add this, so that's I'll preface that. But the neurodynamics piece of it was something that when it came up as we were looking at putting this together, I thought, man, that's really smart. I didn't even think about kind of going through some of this with a coach in particular. But as we're teaching the course and looking at some of these assessments with the tests and the retests, one of the pieces that we got into was kind of how do you improve neurodynamics and what that is to begin with, and people seeing changes in their overhead position or whatever it is, or forward bend or whatever we're looking at. So I think that is kind of uncharted territory for a lot of people that are not in the kind of practitioner realm. So can you give a little explanation of what neurodynamics is and why a strength coach or some sort of movement coach would want to actually know what that is and what to do with it? Yeah,
the thinking sometimes is that we see that there are, the body's a clever system, and it will, when it's in a good position, things work really well. Tunnel, meat slides over meat. Nerves slide through meat tunnels. And when you're in a bad position or a less optimal position, we confuse that as functional. That is my definition of functional position. Oh yeah, you stood up all right. Good job. How's your back? How's your knee? How's your hip doing? Because you stood up. So that's functional. But we're not into functional. We're into expressing what the human being is supposed to do. And if you've collapsed your arch and your knee slammed in and you impinged your hip during that squat, we had an athlete at the gym, who was a regional competitor, and she was a national champion gymnast. And she was really into like doing the Olympic lifts, and she would slam her hip in, and I'd be like, bro, you can't, just like heads up. That is something we're trying to slow down and minimize. And then one day she came in and she's like, I think I tore my labrum, my hip all hurts, and I was like, oh, I wonder how that happened. She's like, I don't know, just the volume. And I was like, I know. I watched you do that position 500 times. So I only ask you not to fix it or to fix it 499 times. And, the key here is that when our bodies are better positioned, again, one of the things that happens is that the nervous system stops protecting us. So, for example, if you overextend your lumbar spine, we do a test we call the flinch test, and you lay on your back, and if you lift your legs up fast, what you'll see is that a lot of people don't know how to sequence correctly and basically organize and stiffen their trunk in the right order. So what ends up happening is legs fire. You try to lift your legs up off the ground, and what we see is it looks like an alien is popping out of your stomach, right? And you see this horrible flinch. Belly bulges out, psoas turns on, and right there we'll say, people, take a breath for me. And the only way people can breathe is actually in their chest. Their diaphragm literally starts to become shut down. They can only do this shallow passive accessory breathing. And what ends up happening then is when we assess neural tension, we assess what looks like tight hamstrings. What ends up happening is that people with that motor pattern often display, and when I say often, I'm saying 100% of the time, display positions that look like stiffness but aren't stiffness. They're the nervous system making the body restrict its range of motion. So what looks like, if we do we do kind of a hamstring test, I'll just say that, right? It's leg extension when the hip is flexed, like you're laying on your back, pulling your knee to chest. What ends up happening is it looks like people are missing gigantic swaths of territory in their hamstrings. And then we have them sequence, do some diaphragmatic breathing, and all of a sudden their hamstrings go to full length, full power, where literally we get 30 or 40 degrees of range of motion out of someone's hamstrings. And everyone looks like it's voodoo science, but all it is that we've now applied our thinking to saying, hey, look, when we're talking about centrating joints or getting in a good position, we're also affecting the nervous system. And that's one of the reasons why it's important that a coach can see this, because if not, we end up fighting against ourselves. And what ends up happening, what ends up happening is George is asking me if she's making dinner tonight, my 12-year-old, and she's like, hey, should I put foil underneath the fries that I'm making? And I was like, no, you should not. And that's right. Why? Because you don't want to eat foil, girl. Aluminum is not good for girls. That's right. And so the idea here is, when we start to look at stiffness in the thoracic spine or head positioning, those are all large force, active forces or translational forces on the nervous system, where the nervous system starts to protect itself. And then we can't actually ever have full range of motion or express full power. And this is one of the reasons we've always said, hey, changes in the nervous system, those local hinges are a problem. And how, a coach, if you bend over to grab the barbell and your belly bulges out, right? So if I have you stand up and say, all right, get stiff, right? Squeeze your butt. Take a big breath, get your belly tight, now take a big breath. That volume of stiffness in your trunk should remain constant through your hinge. And what we'll see, and if you go on Instagram and watch a lot of athletes, you'll see that as they deadlift and move slow, their bellies actually push out. And that's a good indicator that they've actually lost position integrity and intra-abdominal pressure on the trunk, and they're starting to hang on secondary structures, which actually implicate how the nerves are running through the nerve tunnels. And this all seems very complicated until you're aware of it, and then realize that good positioning and good mechanics automatically protects you from these down regulatory features.
So let me see how well I've learned here on this conversation and try to apply this neurodynamics to something I might do. So let's take me off the floor and get me standing up a little bit. So if I were to say go into maybe like a tempoed overhead squat, something like a 10-second down, hold it for 10, and then come up nice and slow.
Stop. Why would you do that?
I'm asking. I'm saying, would this be a
that's the worst, hardest move you could do. Like, I'm just saying you should respect yourself and do it fast.
No.
Obviously, that is just too much work. You're going to expose all the problems because
there it is.
If you stand up and squeeze your butt and pull your rib cage down, that's how your spine should look the entire time. And if you start introducing a whole bunch of hinges, and so this is an important concept, is that, what we've said is, hey, you went up and down with a barbell over your head. Great job. You overhead squatted. And that's true. That's fine with a PVC pipe the first time, right? But what we're trying to do is train people to squat with a torso upright. Mm-hmm. And if you can't do that, then your torso, by definition, is going to have to come forward. And if it can't come, if it comes forward, then you better have massive amounts of range of motion in your shoulders so that you can internally rotate the shoulder into a less than awesome position, but still keep the barbell centered over your center of mass over your foot. If you cannot do that, then what you're going to do is start looking like a broken snake, and you're going to start adding snake segments and broken parts of your rainbow on the way down. You're going to overextend in the back. You're going to overextend your neck. You're going to overextend through and you basically have few segments that are creating additional hip joints for you, additional shoulder joints for you. And what we don't recognize is those practice patterns and those positions have large implication on my ability to generate force. And by the way, those are also the positions where we get a hot facet or a spondy or disc irritation or a neurodynamic problem. I mean, that is the same mechanism. So I don't need to sidelie you and test your instability. I can watch you squat. And if you show me all of those broken snake hinges, otherwise, look, here's the problem. Good movement is totally boring. It is so boring watching a good athlete go up and down. Nothing moves. Their feet look like feet. The knees do the same thing every single time. There's no change in position. You're like, I'm so bored. What's exciting as a coach is to see someone snake down and collapse their feet and put all these wobbles in the middle of the system, like you're trying to hold up a limp hose. And I want to, for me as a coach, I'm like, I don't know if they're going to stand up. This is very exciting. I don't know what's going to happen next. It's like a good murder mystery. Instead of like, I've seen this plot before, the athlete makes the lift. And, it's interesting, but a lot of our master coaches have this intuitive, intrinsic assessment. Like, how many times, Joe, have you been with a master Olympic lifting coach and someone receives the weight in the bottom? They're like, nope, not standing that up. Or they go for the jerk and they watch the dip. They're like, nope. And you're like, what? He hasn't even done the movement yet, right? And that's just advanced pattern recognition for the exact same things we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think that the other area that you guys kind of hit the nail on the head with is the speed kind of component. And what made a lot of sense to me when I first kind of got into your theory, Kelly, was the idea of these kind of levels of movement that layer on top of each other. And in fact, I had a lady today, I discharged her today. She's had back pain for about 10 years. And on the first visit, I think I saw her about 5 times. And on the first visit, we went over the hip hinge because I asked her how she picked her kids up, which was a big problem. And she basically just rounded her back and didn't hinge her hip at all. So first thing we did was go over hip hinge. This is how you hip hinge. Today we went over kettlebell swings because she wants to get back into training again, and her husband has kettlebells. So we go over kettlebell swings, and we start going through the hip hinge, and she goes, wait a second. Isn't this the same thing we went over the first visit? And I said, yes, it's the exact same thing. And she goes, oh, I get it. And it's like this light bulb moment, but it was the application of applying those over the appropriate kind of domain and when she could control it. So, for coaches out there, because I think that made so much sense to me, and something that we reiterate in this course as well. How would you explain somebody like, okay, you have to do this first, this first, this first, in terms of the categories of how you'd have somebody move? So how would you have somebody go through, like, for instance, the squat archetype with different categories?
Well, this is old supple leopard thinking, but one of the things that we're trying to do is show the similarities in movements and show what is different. What is different about a front squat versus a wall ball. And I know you don't wall ball with 100 kilos. Maybe you do, Joe, but
no.
The idea here is
I hate wall balls.
That's good. Everyone should, because it's a terrible, hard position transfer exercise, right? It's conditioning, right? But the issue is, if I give you a ball and have you hold that at your chest, and just like goblet squat, let's just call it a dynamic goblet squat, and you squat down. You squat down, and everything is in a good position, and your feet are good, and your back is good, and your knees don't wobble. And all of a sudden, hey, let's add some speed to that, i.e., let's jump down from this box, right? Let's swing this kettlebell. Let's receive this wall ball. Let's receive this power clean, right? Then it should be the same thing. But all we've done is add speed to those positions, and what we start to see is when we add speed, I start to challenge your motor control a little bit more, and I also start to implicate your range of motion, because one of the reasons powerlifters can get away with being powerlifters is they move so stinking slow, is that they can set up in a good position. I'm not saying they're not powerful. Here comes all the hate mail from powerlifters. But what ends up happening is that those powerlifters can get into a stable position and grind through those shapes, right? And I'm not talking about speed bench, right, or speed squats, because those things are still not as fast as actual sports. But what ends up happening is that they're able to hide their range of motion limitations, because they're able to get into a good start position and grind through to another position, the second position, and then grind back up. And when you start adding speed to those things, you can no longer buffer those ranges of motion. So here's a simple test, for example, that illustrates this, right? Press, strict press, push jerk. Like, you'll see that all the old stiff guys don't mind pressing, and they kind of hem and haw a little bit about the push press, but it looks like a muscle press, right? And then you ask them to push jerk, and they can't do it. Their shoulders literally won't do it because they don't have the range of motion to do it. Here's another test. Go ahead and stand up and perform an air squat. Great job. You can even let your torso come forward, like you're doing your best show squat. Then stand up and drop down and spontaneously achieve the bottom position of the same squat. And all we've done is we started cutting the connection. You can't hide that range of motion, and it should look exactly the same. Your feet should be in the exact same position. There's no wobbliness. Your knees don't cave in. There's no speed wobbles in that. There are no trivial events. Then get on your knees, and all I want you to do is jump up and land in a squat from your knees, right? And if you are an athlete or an athletic person, that is not a challenging range or challenging shape. But I guarantee you that if you have a range of motion restriction, it will show up when you jump from your knees, because you cannot hide your range of motion restriction in your ankle. You have to spontaneously have access to it. If you're missing range of motion in your hip, you're not going to be able to land in a good position without a huge foot turnout and a knee wobble duck landing shape, because you can't hide that. It's like, it's easy for us to have a little speed wobble in the wheel when we're race cars, but as soon as we start going fast, man, and that wheel starts getting skatey, like, you're all over the place. You can't steer it that way. And that's why it's so important that we put athletes under speed, and so important why we introduce speed, and why sometimes when all we did was back squat, right, and bench press, we're never really going to find out who people are. And it's not until we start changing shape and changing directions that we can really get to the bottom of people's mechanics. Otherwise, they might be able to hide it from us for a long time.
Well, talk to me about working that idea in reverse, and I'll explain in a moment, because I've spent a good bit of time Olympic weightlifting and have achieved subpar standards or numbers. But what's interesting is, in a programming twist, my coach has thrown in a bunch of pause squats, and he's been telling me that stop bouncing, we're going to work on some strength stuff. And I've had the worst time managing this situation where going slow is actually kicking my ass a lot more than actually doing the full lifts. So in your mind, what does that tell you about me as an athlete?
Well, it tells me a really good coach. Because what we want to make sure is that we have neuromuscular control in these full ranges, mm-hmm. and what we do when because when people start doing tempo squats, and I literally like rolled my eyes. I was like, oh yeah, time under tension, here we go, But then I really was like, oh yeah, you can't hide. What you'll see is that oftentimes people will start to squat, and it's like someone, like you're descending in an elevator. All of a sudden, someone cuts the cord in the elevator, and you drop 10 floors.
Sure. Right,
and then the emergency brakes come back on. You're like, yeah, it's good, we're all back. Well, instead of being able to generate force or absorb force in a full range. So you're connected through range. And oftentimes what we see is that, look, I teach my daughters to Olympic lift, and it's not an accident that we teach, from positions like the high hang instead of the challenge range of motion. So it's okay to challenge these ranges of motion with speed, but notice that oftentimes in the lexicon of Olympic lifting, we end up protecting people's range of motion. We don't say, here's the full barbell snatch, empty barbell snatch, go. Right? We do hang muscle snatch, and then we hang power snatch. Then we overhead squat, and we overhead squat a little deeper. Right? We end up really guiding people's range of motion to these windows where they're going to have better success as they connected. But one of the things that we see is that when we ask people, for example, in their Olympic lifts, how much time have you spent in the bottom position? If we aggregated a training session, what you'll often see is that it may be 10 total seconds, total over an hour and a half in the bottom shape. At your most compromised, weakest, most restricted, challenging position, you're down there. And what I'll guarantee you is that the Chinese lifters do not have that problem. And what we're seeing is by forcing you to go slow, we're confronting the fact that you're using elasticity of your tissues and potentially compensation mechanisms to get through those sticky points, right? Where you've lost neuromuscular control, but instead you have this thing called fascia. And, you're able to bounce. And not that bouncing is not vital or valuable, but that you also need to show me that you can control those positions, right? And those tempo really is a nice way of illustrating the competency of these end ranges, which is why we put tempo movements into our assessment, because we need to see that you actually can maintain integrity and control and breathe or stability in these shapes under a little bit of controlled motion. And so, it's as a drill. I mean, as you know, all of a sudden when you go back to the game, you're like, oh, it's all connected that way.
No, it makes total sense. And I think anybody that would even, think about coming to an advanced course have obviously already gone through either the 1-day course that we've put on or the 101 course, and all this stuff will mesh and make so much sense, and it'll be like you took the pill in the Matrix and you see everything for what it really is. But Kelly, we know you're hungry. You're about to eat some non-foil tasting fries. You're a busy guy. We 100% appreciate your time. And what I'd like to do is, if people want more information about this 102 course, where it's going to be, who's teaching it, all kinds of stuff. If they want more information on it, where can they go? What's the best place for them to kind of get that information?
Well, if you have any questions, you can email Danny@mobilitywod.com.
100% email me any question you have.
That's right. Right. Should I use Viagra? Yes or no? One of the things that is really great about the dynamic between you two is it's what we're trying to achieve in the 102 course. We have high-level coaching, we have high-level expertise in movement, and we have the physical therapist who also can coach, and the coach who also speaks the language of improved movement. And I think what we need to remind people is that there's a lot of capacity to be gained about efficiency in your coaching. And a long time ago, as the last example before we tell people where to go, is I remember I would, as a young coach, literally 11 years ago, I would fly down and work for Mike Bergner for free. He would allow me to assist his courses. I would just be an assistant, do whatever he needed, help however I could help. And he allowed me to show up and work for him for free, and I got the better end of the deal. It was all on my dime. I slept on someone's couch. I showed up, and then after the first one, he was like, if you'd like to come back, you're welcome. And I was like, holy shit, this is amazing. And I remember, the first week watching him do 50 skill transfer exercises and being blown away, because I was like, how will I ever learn 50 skill transfer exercises? And it turns out that if you actually can do what your coach asks you to do because you have full range of motion, you need 1 skill transfer exercise or 2 skill transfer exercises. You don't have to coach around the problem. You can go ahead and actually teach with a couple drills to get what you want. And what I realized is that he was working around a lot of fundamental tissue restrictions. People could not get into the shapes he was asking because they physically could not. And so instead he had to do all of these drills to kind of sneak the back door into someone, being in a better overhead position or better hang position, and what we realized is that, hey, let's go ahead and clean that out and optimize these positions. I got a really nice email. Kara Heed is an old friend of ours, pretty good Olympic lifter. I think she was in the Olympics. And, she was like, hey, Cal, I really appreciate you've actually made it a lot easier for me to coach Olympic lifting because people have the language of Olympic lifting. And it's why Olympic lifting is so important and why we teach it, because it's a pretty complete movement practice. What you're missing is a little benching in there, but otherwise you're going to hit all the corners. And, she said also, you made it really easy for me to fix people's incomplete position. So I don't have to spend 10 hours, moving away from the things that are actually training us. And so that's really what we're trying to do. We've got to streamline it so that the coaching, when people come to the gym, they can get more out of it. That when they invest training time, they can get more out of it. And then when they have a problem, we can get to the bottom of the problem very quickly because, every once in a while you're going to overdo it. And, and you got off the airplane and then went for a run and some box jumps and now your foot hurts. Who's responsible to take care of that? And instead of playing press and guess, we want to advance the conversation further. So check us out at mobilitywod.com. We have all our upcoming courses. If you want to come study with Danny, you can do that. I think you've got one in Atlanta. This thing, it's rad. It's a rad course. It's really fun. Really, and we have NFL coaches take it. We have, high school athletic trainers take it. So many people have taken this course. We have physios who come and we're like, why didn't I learn these assessments? I had to learn all this correlate language for the thing that I'm trying to fix. So, I guarantee you'll get something out of it. And, again, mobilitywod.com. And I'm really proud that we're actually at a point in our sort of development as a profession where we can give this information and people understand it and immediately go apply it. It's really cool.
Well, there it is, guys. Kelly, man, we appreciate you. Danny, thanks for getting him on the show here to talk about the course. Gang, get out there. It's easy enough.
Well, last thing is, I think there was a Saturday Live about hosting 5 times. So,
well, hey,
when do I get to come? I got to be the guy who's been on fifth. I want to be the 5th time guy first.
Well, let's dial it in. My wife, she's hounding me. She actually wants, we started French pressing our coffee a little bit, and I hear that you're a bit of a coffee freak. So maybe we'll get you on and we'll talk a little coffee. You'll give us some tips or tricks to get that going. We'd love to have you, Kelly. You're always a good guest. Great content, fun stuff, and maybe we need to do a show about your daughters and their training. I think the kids stuff is always interesting too. So,
well, you should get Juliet and I have a talk about that. And I appreciate it. What's fun about coming on, this podcast is that one, you guys get about 500,000 downloads a week, which is really amazing.
Easily.
So I feel like
or you wouldn't be here.
It's not good for our community. It's good for me and my business. But I really feel like, I know you guys, and and I feel like I get to tee off in a way that sometimes I don't get to do, and you guys get me more fired up than anyone else.
Fired up. Well, shoot, I'm fired up. I might go back out in the garage here, or maybe when it's bedroom time, we'll try a couple positions out on the wife. But we'll figure it out, guys. That's Kelly Starrett. We got Doc Danny. I'm Coach Joe, and guys, this is the Doc and Jock Podcast, proving folks that if you have a body,
you're an athlete.